Hey. As Ed said, I spent 12 years at the BBC working across natural history and science digital output. One of those projects was Spring Watch and Autumn Watch, which obviously Tim is going to talk about in a lot more detail after me. But we knew we were successful. We knew lots of people came to those projects. We knew that they were loved. We knew that people did lots of interesting things as a result of watching the programmes. But when I left the BBC a couple of years ago to set up Hawk Morph, one of the questions I was really interested in is, what was the impact? Could we measure the impact? Could I find a way to kind of do a bit of a review and get to the kind of nitty-gritty of what kind of impact we were having? So I went off to the Oxford Internet Institute part-time to have a look at some of those questions, and some of the things I'm going to share here come out of that work. So why the mania? Well, this piece of work, which was done a couple of years ago by the BBC, with a body of commissioned researchers, some of you may have seen this. It's the BBC Participation Choice work, and it's available publicly, so do go and have a look at it. And what they aimed to do was as George was talking about this morning, was look at default positions on user participation, because everyone kind of stuck to the 1990 rule, which, again, some of you may have heard of, which is that only the 1 and the 9 of that 1990 are actively doing anything on digital platforms. And the leader of that piece of work, a lovely lady called Holly Goodyear, suspected that was no longer the case. And what this research shows is that, it has changed massively. So now you can assume that most people, 77%, are actually actively participating in digital platforms with digital content. The 23% that are passive are now generally choosing to be passive. They are not. It's not because they don't have access either at work or at home. They are actively choosing not to participate. But the inevitable consequence of that participation is opportunity and, of course, mania. Where there is opportunity, there is proliferation. And what happens is that you end up with this bewildering array of possibility for your messaging. And if you're a small organisation with limited resources, how on earth do you decide which one of these is appropriate for you, how you put them together, how you manage and budget for all of that, where you should even begin? And that's another one of the questions that I was really interested in trying to answer was, what ones, how do you go about deciding? And what I ended up doing was going back to a very fundamental question. When clients kind of come to me, and when people came to me at the BBC with a proposal, with an idea that often they were very passionate about, the question I would always ask is, well, what are you actually trying to achieve here? So before you begin to think about a channel, you need to be really clear about what it is you're trying to achieve. And if you really unpick all of that, it could be a number of things, and it might be several things together. So actually, you might really want to get mass participation to collect data. It's a citizen science project you're talking about, and that may involve several different audiences. Or you may want to challenge opinion. You may want to challenge received wisdom. You might want to overturn some perception, the kind of thing Ed was talking about earlier about immigration. Or you might want to lobby and change policy and run a petition and those things. So you start with what do you want to do, what are you trying to achieve, and what story are you trying to tell here? Now, in order to kind of move that through, there's quite a rigorous process that I evolved as a commissioner and producer that I'm going to share with you. Now, this is the abridged version. and I kind of, over time, obviously, you internalise this, and your experience reinforces some of the things that you've learned over time. But just to pick out a few of these, one of the big things, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone who ever came to me, is that why are we doing it? Because often I'd get passionate about a particular idea or a particular project, and I would have a beautifully crafted vision of how wonderful it was going to be and how everybody would love it. What this process does is it makes you kind of distance yourself from your passion and actually look at what impact you are likely to be able to have, given the strength of that idea. And one of the things that, of course, is essential is knowing who your audience is, because if you know who they are, you know where they are, you know what you're competing who you're competing with for their attention. You start to refine what channels you might find them in and what channels you might use. And one of the things that was critical in a lot of the projects I did, because I was working with science and nature content, was, is this a genuine ask? Ed referred to the whole idea of getting people to do things that actually don't mean anything. You know, and there's nothing wrong with that sometimes if it's just about somebody doing something in their coffee break that just makes them think about some beautiful aspect of nature. But equally, if you genuinely want to engage them, what you're asking them to do, is it a genuine ask? Do they get some value from it, and do you get some value from it? Because people see through that stuff really quickly, and then they don't come back. But if you can ask them quite difficult questions if it's a genuine one. If they're contributing new science, for example, they'll go quite a long way to help you. And I've got a few examples where I talk about reward and how that reinforces the impact you're trying to have. So as I say, you may need a matrix of channels, but you'll only know that when you know who your audience are. And knowing who your audience are means putting yourself in their shoes. This is Mindspace, and I don't know if many of you have come across this before, but it's one lens through which you can try to do that. You can put yourself in the shoes of your target group, of your user. It was published by the Cabinet Office, 2011-2012. It came out of the Behavioural Insights team, which now is part of Nesta. Still exist, and again, public domain, so go and have a look. I've abridged this horribly here in terms of giving you an idea of what it's about, but the Mindspace list is a strong way to begin to think like your user. So, for example, the messenger. Who's asking me to do this, and do I trust that person? Now, obviously, a messenger like David Attenborough is highly trusted. But your messenger for your particular audience and your particular project might not be anybody well known. This is a framework that works whatever the scale of your project. There was a very good example of where there was a big public health initiative in a part of Africa where they were looking at HIV education and young women, and they put it into all of the local clinics, and it failed quite spectacularly. And they realised that they were using the wrong messengers. And the messenger that the girls, when they talked to them and got to know them and trialled and had conversations with them, they listened more to their hairdressers. So they trained the hairdressers in all of the villages where the target group was, and got huge uptake for the campaign and got the messaging across. So it's just one example of how to work with that. The examples I'm going to follow here quickly with are going to focus on affect, emotional associations, commitment and ego. As I said, I'm going to look at reciprocity and feedback. And ego because of that positive self-image thing that's been mentioned a couple of times this morning. There's a researcher at the University College London called Tali Sharratt, and obviously her work has a relationship to what George was talking about, Professor Kahneman. What her work says is that we are constantly trying to reinforce a positive self-image. And so that's partly why we shut out messages that make us feel bad about ourselves. So if you think about people's motives and you think about their needs, going back to that kind of commissioner's checklist, their needs, one of their needs is not to feel guilty every time the environment is mentioned. And so some of these projects aim to kind of overcome some of those things. So I'm just going to rattle through those and give you a few things to think about. Now, you'll be familiar with this, I'm sure. And what's interesting about this one, I think, is that, as I say, it focuses on the messenger. Yao Ming is an incredibly popular basketball player, huge social media following, and a really powerful influencer. But the marriage, the collaboration of the organisations on this to create a single issue, and a very simple call to action on both sides. So the people who were asked to take the action, there were very few barriers to entry. It was a very clear ask, but it was a very clear ask on the other side too, and a very polite one, and a very successful campaign. And everyone who did it, didn't take them very long to do it, but felt better about themselves as a result. The other thing that I get asked a lot about, and people kind of ring me up and say, oh, I think we need a YouTube channel, or I think we need to do games. And they may not be wrong about that, but the critical thing really is to think about, you know, whether that's right for the message and whether that's right for the audience you're trying to talk to. There was a conference in 2011 in Cambridge called Games for Nature, when a number of academics came together and looked at the potential for gaming and nature messaging. And they discovered during that debate that actually the main issue with the ones that were existing at that point was this. It was still broccoli at the end of the day. It was, it might have been dressed up as a game, but people, as I say, they know the difference. And most of the games weren't entertaining enough. Really, entertainment has to come first. And one example, one recent study, which I think shows some really, really clever attempts to tackle this, because as people have said, games really are like dopamine. If you get them right, they can be extremely powerful. And the term gamification has been bandied around a lot in the last few years. It's the application of gaming principles to interactive ideas and content. What Paula Owen, she did a 12-month study. She started offline. She started by taking games which we're all familiar with for a certain age anyway, and she recast them. So she took Snakes and Ladders, she took Bingo, she took games that we know, there are low barriers to entry, we know how to play them, we know how to tell other people to play them. She put them in an outreach space, and she crafted environmental messages to sit behind the gameplay. What she found was that the actions that people were asked to absorb as part of that, they were still doing 3, 4, 5 months later. Now, some of the simple ones were the ones that they picked up, and they were still promising to do the slightly harder ones. But the feedback from her events was that was a huge amount of fun. And it really was... Somebody actually said, I feel less guilty, I know what to do now. So getting to that kind of feeling of overcoming that guilt. The thing I also like about that is something that the marketers in the 50s knew, was that we are suckers for nostalgia. And she, by picking up on that, in terms of that emotional engagement, it feels very familiar to us. It's a very easy route in for us to, and makes us feel good about an experience we had in childhood. The other thing I get asked, of course, is we need to be interactive, and we need to invest in interactivity. And yes, it can be incredibly powerful. And when I was at the BBC, we ran a project called Lab UK, which was a way of marrying up current scientific questions where scientists needed data with the BBC population, with the public through the BBC, so that we delivered the front end and the interface, and they managed the data, and they got the volume that they needed to qualify the question. Now, you would think that would be quite a hard ask, and often it was quite difficult subject. We didn't dumb down the science at all to do that. But we had thousands of people take part. And one of the reasons why I think that was successful was because we gave people a very straightforward payoff. We said, do this and we will tell you more about yourself as a result. And you'll contribute to topical science. You'll create new science. And that's also been reinforced by some recent work with some nature conservation projects, where 2 projects leap to mind, Bee Watch and Mink App, which aim to inspire a new generation of recorders to improve the quality of data capture, and it offers feedback. As you submit data, it helps you to refine what you understand, it gives you expert input. It's all automated, but the sense is very much that it's a personal support for you as you learn this new skill. And so the data gets better, you feel better, you're learning something new, and you stick with it. And I think the feedback is underused and extremely powerful, and not necessarily hard to do now. The kind of natural language generators that we use with red kites and sharks for tweeting, again shows that this stuff is possible. And one quick example from the health sphere, and the other thing I do a lot of is look at digital health projects. Kias Muli-platform is a employee wellness interface. It was developed by a guy called Bosworth who set up Google Health, and he'll be the first to admit that Google Health didn't work, because Google Health was a database where you put in all of your health parameters and you could track them and manage them, a bit like a financial management tool. But of course, inevitably, the end result of that is, oh, you're a bit overweight, oh, you need to change your diet. And all the messages coming out of that were quite negative, and people went, like, health and in the environment have a lot of parallels, and behavioural change around those things is really interesting, the crossover in terms of the way that you can approach it. So what he did was he used gamification, and he used social media, and he used the power of connecting people. And what's lovely about the way Kias is put together is that it's very accessible for everybody. So if you can't run, but you can walk every day, you can partner up in a group with people who do marathons, but you all contribute to a collective team system where you compete with other teams in your workplace, and you get points and rewards, and you can share tips about what you're doing to improve your health, what you can do to improve all kinds of aspects of your health behaviour. And again, at the end of the study period, people had embedded more of those pro-health behaviours into their daily lives, and many of them have lost weight as a result. And just finally, before I hand over to Tim, video. Now, of course, one of the things, as I say, people say is we need a YouTube channel, we need more video. And again, video is extremely powerful. We found at the BBC, of course, that you can get lots of people to watch a show if you handle the video in the right way. And again, you don't need massive scale. You just need to think very carefully about how you're using video. And also, just one of the things we learnt from doing South Pacific and the slow-mo surfer, just to share the background, what happened, I was the commissioner when South Pacific was going out, and there was a digital budget issue within the wider BBC, and they cut my budget. And I had about £5,000, which is kind of a healthy amount of money, but within the BBC, kind of not an awful lot. So we took one or two clips and we seeded them into communities around the globe. We kind of wrote to them all and said, this is coming up, isn't this amazing? Here's what you can, we'll help you craft the messaging, but you can have real impact with this. And we looked at communities that weren't traditional natural history audiences. We looked at surfers, and we did it again with Big Cat Diary when we looked at flyers, at aerial enthusiasts. So you can look beyond your traditional communities for new audience to extend the reach and create the impact you want. And ultimately, I think it comes back to, as I say, to the story that you're trying to tell. And Tim and I had the luxury with Springwatch of having a long period of time to kind of experiment with audiences, to try different ways of telling stories, testing the impact we were having. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to him to tell you more about it.